The world does not lack for maps, but it suffers from a profound silence regarding the spaces between the lines. Sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not found in what was discovered, but in the specific, documented moments when a rational mind decided to stop looking back. The case of Karl Brugger in the city of Akakor is one such silence, recorded in the humidity of the Amazon and the cold archives of the Rio police. The humidity in Manaus during the summer of 1972 was a physical weight, a thick curtain of moisture that seemed to blur the edges of every conversation. In the dim light of a waterfront bar, journalist Karl Brugger sat across from a man who called himself Tatunka Nara, a figure whose presence felt out of step with the modern, bustling port. On the table between them lay a series of hand-drawn maps, their ink slightly bled by the damp air, tracing routes into the Wap's basin that existed in no official atlas. Brugger, a man trained in the clinical detachment of German journalism, found himself recording every word as if the air itself were holding its breath. The initial interviews were conducted with a methodical precision, captured on magnetic tape that hissed with the background noise of the docks. Tatunka Nara spoke of a subterranean fortress called Akakor, a place where stone and shadow met beneath the roots of the world. There was no mention of magic or spirits, only the logistics of survival and the architectural reality of a civilization that had retreated from the light. Brugger's notes from those first nights are remarkably dry, focusing on estimated coordinates and the specific mineral composition of the walls Nara described. Back in his cramped office, the journalist began cross-referencing the prince's claims with declassified colonial records and fragmented Portuguese expedition logs from the 18th century. He found strange, inexplicable gaps in the official cartography of the northern Amazon, areas where surveyors had simply turned back without explanation. A particular report from 1753 mentioned a, quote, walled settlement cited by a scouting party, though the coordinates were lost to water damage. This crumb of historical evidence acted as a catalyst, transforming a curious story into an investigative obsession that began to consume Brugger's professional life. As the months passed, the correspondence between the two men grew more technical, involving lists of supplies, medical kits, and specialized lighting equipment. Brugger's journals from this period reflect a man balancing on the edge of skepticism, constantly questioning the validity of the physical artifacts Nara occasionally produced. One such item was a small, heavy piece of worked stone that felt unnaturally cold even in the tropical heat, its surface etched with geometric patterns that defied easy classification. It sat on Brugger's desk like a silent anchor, grounding the wilder parts of the narrative in tangible, heavy reality. The publication of The Chronicle of Akakor in 1976 brought a sudden, unwanted spotlight to the shadowy corners of the Waps. While the public clamored for the sensational, Brugger remained focused on the logistical preparation for a definitive, documented trek to the coordinates. His apartment became a staging ground, filled with crates of high-altitude film and crates of non-perishable rations. The silence of the jungle seemed to have followed him into the city, making the mundane sounds of Rio de Janeiro feel thin and distant. By the early 1980s, the atmosphere surrounding the project had shifted from academic curiosity to a palpable, lingering dread. Rumors began to circulate in the expatriate community of other explorers who had attempted to find Nara's city and had simply stopped communicating. Consular records from the time show a series of missing persons reports, all linked by a final known location in the same unmapped sector of the rainforest. Brugger noted these disappearances in the margins of his drafts, his handwriting becoming smaller and more cramped as the list of names grew. The tension reached a peak in the final weeks of 1983, as the departure date for the ultimate expedition drew near. Brugger's final recorded interview with Tatunka Nara is hauntingly quiet, filled with long pauses where only the sound of a ceiling fan is audible. Nara's voice on the tape is a low drone, warning of the restricted zones that were governed by military patrols and ecological hazards rather than ancient curses. It was a warning rooted in the politics of the soil, a reminder that the jungle was a place of very real, very human consequences. On the morning of January 11984, work began on Ipanema Beach with a clear and focused atmosphere. Carl Brugger was walking toward a meeting to finalize the expedition's last permit when a single individual approached him. There was no conflict or interruption, only the sudden sound of an object falling on the pavement. As Brugger stumbled, the person walked away into the crowd, leaving unanswered questions that the police worked to resolve. The subsequent investigation by the Rio authorities was a study in frustration and dead ends. Officers found Brugger's briefcase untouched, containing nothing but a set of revised maps and a letter of intent for the Brazilian Ministry of the Interior. The motive for the killing remained an atmospheric void, as nothing of value had been stolen from the journalist's person. It appeared as though the bullet had been intended not to rob a man, but to archive a project permanently before it could begin. In the wake of the funeral, the Akakor files were moved to a secure police storage facility where they sat among hundreds of other unsolved homicides. The maps that had once promised a revelation were now just pieces of evidence, tagged with yellow labels and filed away in dark drawers. The, quote, indigenous prince himself retreated back into the foliage, his true identity and motives remaining as obscured as the fortress he described. The first chapter of the Akakor mystery ended not with a discovery, but with a quiet, violent stop. The review of Brugger's case served as an additional safeguard, protecting the public from noticing the increasing number of inconsistencies in the Akakor story. Investigators observed that multiple people who had previously looked for the city with Tatunka Nara had also gone missing, but no remains were ever found by the water. The case records started to suggest a sequence, not of old enigmas, but of a planned dangerous cycle happening in the remote wild. Each absence was followed by a money exchange or a delivery of costly gear, all vanishing into the trees with the men who possessed them. By 1985, the Brazilian authorities began to look closer at the man calling himself Tatunka Nara, discovering a history that was far more mundane and unsettling than a royal indigenous lineage. Records surfaced of a German citizen named Hans Günther Hauck, who had abandoned his family in the late 1960s to start a new life in the Amazon. The prince was not a relic of a hidden past, but a projection of a European man who had mastered the art of reinvention. This revelation turned the search for a city into a search for a ghost who was still very much alive and operating in the shadows of the frontier. The trail led back to a series of remote outposts, where Hauck, as Nara, had served as a guide for high-profile tourists and amateur historians. Witness statements from these outposts describe a man of intense, quiet charisma who could convince seasoned outdoorsmen that the next bend in the river would reveal stone walls. He spoke of forbidden zones, where the Brazilian military allegedly conducted secret operations, using these real-world restricted areas to explain why certain paths could not be taken. It was a perfect blend of geopolitical reality and fabricated secrecy, designed to keep his clients exactly where he wanted them. One survivor of a 1987 expedition recalled the atmosphere of their trek as one of constant, suffocating surveillance by the forest itself. They spent weeks navigating narrow tributaries where the water was the color of dark tea and the silence was only broken by the mechanical click of Nara checking his equipment. The guide would often vanish for hours, returning with stories of scouts from Akakor who were watching their progress from the ridgelines. There was never any physical evidence of these scouts, only the growing paranoia of the men who had paid for the privilege of being led into the unknown. The physical reality of the Waps Basin provided the perfect cover for this slow-burn psychological game. The terrain is a labyrinth of whitewater rapids and dense primary forest, where GPS coordinates often fail due to the thick canopy cover. Archival maps from the period show large patches labeled simply as insufficient data, a cartographic admission of defeat that Nara used to his advantage. In these blank spaces, he was the sole arbor of truth, guiding his followers deeper into a territory where the laws of the outside world ceased to function. In the late 1980s, a joint task force between Brazilian and German authorities attempted to pin the mounting missing person cases directly on Hauck. They focused on the disappearance of a high-altitude climber who had last been seen boarding a riverboat with the prince near the Colombian border. The boat was later found drifted into a sandbar, its engine intact, but its logbook missing the final 3 days of entries. No struggle was evident, and the supplies remained neatly packed, suggesting that whatever happened had occurred with a terrifyingly calm efficiency. The interrogation of Hauck was a study in restraint, with the suspect maintaining his persona even under the pressure of intense legal scrutiny. He spoke in a soft, rhythmic tone about the laws of the jungle and the inevitable price of curiosity, never admitting to a crime, but never denying the danger. The investigators found themselves trapped in a circular narrative where every question was met with a reference to a city that could not be proven to exist. Without a body or a confession, the legal system was paralyzed by the very emptiness of the rainforest. While the legal battle stalled, independent researchers began to uncover the physical remnants of these failed journeys scattered throughout the basin. A rusted camera lens was found near a tributary in 1991, its serial number matching a piece of equipment Carl Brugger had purchased years earlier. A few miles downstream, a weathered nylon backpack was discovered snagged on a submerged route, containing nothing but a handful of waterlogged maps and a single empty canteen. These artifacts were the only testimony left behind, silent markers of a path that led nowhere. The logs of the river pilots who frequented the northern Amazon during this era are filled with brief, somber entries regarding the Germans' guests. They describe seeing optimistic groups of Europeans heading upriver with expensive gear, only to see Nara return weeks later, alone or with significantly fewer companions. When questioned, Nara would simply state that his clients had reached their destination and chosen to stay, a claim that was impossible to verify given the lack of communication infrastructure. The pilots, accustomed to the oddities of the frontier, rarely pressed for more details, allowing the cycle to continue. By the mid-1990s, the legend of Akakor had largely faded from the headlines, replaced by the grim reality of the Hawk File. The story was no longer about a subterranean fortress, but about the terrifying vulnerability of the human mind when removed from its familiar environment. It was a narrative of archival gaps and judicial failures, a case where the evidence was slowly being reclaimed by the earth itself. The jungle had not hidden a city. It had provided a stage for a long-form deception that left a trail of broken families and empty files. The official investigation into Carl Brugger's murder was eventually moved to the inactive category, though it was never truly closed. The lead detective's final report noted that the journalist had become a victim of the very mystery he sought to document. His death, a final punctuation mark on a story that refused to be resolved. The documents remained in their cardboard boxes, the ink fading a little more each year as the humidity of Rio continued its slow work. The truth remained suspended in the air, as thick and unbreathable as the jungle mist. Each slide in this sequence moves from the psychological manipulation of the prince to the cold, hard evidence found in the mud. The story is now shifting toward the final unresolved state of the case, where the forest remains the only true witness to what occurred in the forbidden zones. In the final years of the century, the Akakor narrative shifted from a pursuit of gold to a pursuit of justice. But the rainforest proved a more effective vault than any safe. In 1998, a specialized forensic team attempted to locate the specific coordinate 0 mentioned in Brugger's final notes, only to find that the landscape had physically altered. Seasonal flooding and the rapid growth of the undergrowth had erased the landmarks described in the 1970s, rendering the original hand-drawn maps functionally useless. The forest had effectively healed over the trail, leaving the investigators to stand in a green vacuum where the evidence had literally been absorbed into the soil. Hans-Gunther Hauck's employee profile was fully revealed as the Prince and was central to a 1999 report by German authorities. Analysts observed that his influence came not from the truth of his statements, but from the pauses he created. He used the environment's gradual effects to prepare people for his final presentation. It was a clear finding that the most significant challenge in the Amazon was not its dangers, but the human tendency to accept untrue stories when circumstances are uncertain. At his remote home in Barcelos, Hauck lived out his final years in a state of quiet, undisturbed independence. He remained a figure of local curiosity, a man who had successfully navigated the boundaries between two worlds and two identities without ever being held to account. Visitors who managed to secure a meeting described a man who spoke of his lost kingdom with a chilling, practiced sincerity that never wavered. He lived surrounded by the artifacts of his past experiences, expensive watches, weathered journals, and German-made optics, treating them as mere souvenirs of a history he had rewritten. The declassified consular files from the 2000s reveal a final somber attempt by the families of the missing to find closure. A series of private expeditions were funded, not to find Akakor, but to find the scattered remains of the men who had followed the prince into the Wawups. These groups utilized modern satellite imagery to look for unnatural clearings or the glint of metallic debris beneath the canopy. They found nothing but the infinite undulating green of the forest, a visual testament to the jungle's ability to keep its secrets. In 2004, a local fisherman discovered a rusted, heavy trunk wedged between two stones at the bottom of a receding riverbed. Inside were several rolls of 35mm film, preserved in a waterproof casing but ruined by decades of heat and chemical degradation. When developed, the images showed only blurred, sepia-toned shapes, shadows of trees, the prow of a boat, and the indistinct silhouette of a man standing on a muddy bank. These ghostly impressions were the last visuals ever recovered from the Brugger era, offering a glimpse of a journey that ended in a photographic fog. The Brazilian Federal Police eventually declared the Akakor file a permanent cold case, citing the lack of physical remains and the statute of limitations on the original crimes. The massive cardboard boxes containing the Brugger investigation were moved to a deeper archival level, where the air was drier and the light was kept low. The maps, once vibrant with the promise of a subterranean empire, were now brittle and yellowed, the ink fading into the parchment. The official record had become as quiet and unreachable as the city it sought to find. Today, observers looking at the northern Amazon see a landscape that remains unmapped in important ways. There are still areas where the tree cover is so dense that the ground has not seen direct sunlight in centuries. It is in these remote areas that the prince's story continues to live, a lingering signal in the records of history. The reality of Akakor is not a place of riches, but a collection of empty locations where men once worked and then simply ceased their activities. The legacy of Karl Brugger is now preserved in a small private memorial in Munich, a simple plaque that mentions his work as a correspondent, but omits the circumstances of his end. His death remains the central anomaly, a violent urban conclusion to a mystery that was supposed to be solved in the wilderness. It serves as a reminder that the lost trail does not always end in the woods. Sometimes, it circles back to the very streets where the journey began. The silence of the Rio homicide files matches the silence of the Amazonian canopy, creating a perfect, closed loop of uncertainty. In the small river towns of the Amazon, the name Tatunka Nara is still spoken in hushed tones, usually by older men who remember the era of the great expeditions. They tell stories of a man who could talk to the river and make the maps lie, a trickster figure who understood the terrain better than the government ever could. These stories are not based on fantasy, but on a grounded respect for a man who managed to disappear in plain sight for 40 years. He was the only one who truly knew the layout of the Forbidden Zones, and he took that knowledge with him when he finally passed. The final archival entry on the Akakor case is a short, typewritten memo from 2012, noting the disposal of several non-essential evidence items due to space constraints. Among the items destroyed were several rusted tins of film and a water-damaged compass that no longer pointed north. This administrative act of erasure was the final death of the Akakor mystery, a quiet acknowledgement that the world had moved on from the enigmas of the 20th century. The trail was not just lost, it was officially closed. Today, the WAPS remains a place of real-world anomalies, governed by military checkpoints, ecological preserves, and the slow, grinding laws of nature. The hidden city remains a fiction, but the men who died looking for it are a documented reality that continues to haunt the historical record. Their stories are preserved in the gaps of the archives, in the redacted lines of police reports, and in the unsettling stillness of the rainforest. The mystery persists not because of what was found, but because of everything that was left behind in the mud. The jungle does not remember the names of the men who enter it, only the weight of their footsteps before they are gone. The documents end here, and the trail remains cold, as silent as the stone walls that were never truly there.